Hello and welcome to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. This week, our guests are the foremost expert on the white power movement in the United States, Professor Kathleen Belew of Northwestern University, and a prominent journalist from The Atlantic and former editor of the New Republic, Frank Foer, who's just written a new book on the first 2 years of the Biden administration. Remember, we love taking your questions, so write into politicswarroom@gmail.com or send a tweet to @Politicon for next week's show. Now, we're going to get to as many as we can, but don't forget to tell us where you're from. And please check out the links to our sponsors, Real Paper, in the show notes. We thank you for supporting the sponsor. It helps make this podcast happen. Please tell your friends about us and remind them to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Frank Foer, who is one of America's really top journalists, has written The Last Politician on the first 2 years of the Biden administration. It was eagerly anticipated, and to date, it is the best account of this presidency. A remarkably productive 2 years, a remarkably underappreciated president. Frank, in your interviews, you have superbly described the inner workings of this administration, and we're going to get to some of that, but Carville and I are old hacks, so we want to start with politics. Some commentators were shocked at last week's Wall Street Journal poll showing Americans think Biden is too old and running at best even. I guess they missed the AP poll and almost every other poll before that. It really wasn't much news. Does anyone in the family, the Biden family, or the White House staff recognize this peril, or do they cling to the myth that only Biden can beat Trump?
I think there's a lot of clinging to that myth. And let's also say that at this stage, it might not be a myth. I mean, who knows what can emerge from a Democratic primary? And in Biden's mind, he's the guy who has the track record. And if it comes down to a comparison between him and Donald Trump, he feels like we have some empirical basis for figuring out how that's going to go. So I think that that's probably closer to the way that they think about this. And it's still a long way to go. I think that the question about aging is really one of the most fascinating questions. And it's a hard one to talk about, because what's embedded in those polling is like everybody who has had a parent or a grandparent who's aged. And so you bring to that discussion all the personal baggage that you have about aging. And when we talk about aging, there's this sense that there's this sell-by date that people have, which is not true. And the thing about Joe Biden is kind of a combination of a guy who's in front of our eyes aging. We can see it in the way that he walks. We can see it in the way that he talks. But he's also, Nikki Haley talks about a test for mental acuity. And I got no doubt that Biden would pass that test if it was applied to him, that you can go through a meeting with Biden where he's going to get a little bit lost in a story that he's told. And maybe Joe Biden always got lost in the stories that he told. And then he's going to turn around and deliver a very masterful presentation about grand strategy in the Indo-Pacific. Both those things are true. Politically, I mean, I would turn to you guys. I'd love your insights into whether the age question is something that Biden can ever really shake, and whether you think that it's going to be the thing that's going to actually define him in a race where Trump is his opponent.
I'm afraid that I do, and I think if you took a survey of leading Democratic politicians who will be on the ballot next year, they would say, give us Gretchen Whitmer, give us Gavin Newsom, give us someone else. And I think almost all of them would say he's been a good president. And Frank, boy, you know so much better than we do about the real Joe Biden, and I accept everything you've said about the fact that he's still cognitively and intellectually there, but it doesn't come every time he goes on television. I worry, I cringe a little bit. Yeah. And I don't know how that changes, Frank.
Yeah. I mean, it's also who he was. And to some extent, it was true in 2020 as well, right? When he debated Trump, didn't you have that same reaction then?
Yeah, I did. But then he was going against a clown, so you knew at least would be offset by that. But no, you're right. It was certainly true in any, earlier I guess going back to 2008 primary debates. Let me ask you about Kamala Harris. Ever since Walter Mondale fashioned arrangements for a VP to be a close advisor of the president, constantly in communication, it's been followed by George H.W. Bush to a degree, and then certainly by Al Gore and by Dick Cheney and by Joe Biden. Harris, however, comes across at least as more like Dan Quayle, not really a very integral part of this administration. How much of that is self-inflicted, which you've written about, and how much of it is the Biden staff or the president? And do they ever think, gosh, maybe we should have chosen somebody else?
I don't know if they think that they should have chosen somebody else. I certainly didn't hear that, but I think that she's the search for a political identity has been the thing that's plagued her since her aborted presidential run in 2020, that she really has struggled to figure out who she is as a political being. And in the administration, she set all sorts of rules initially about what she wanted. And she was reluctant to be the administration's emissary to the political base of the Democratic Party, which is in some ways the obvious thing to do, obvious path for her to take, and she resisted that. She talked a lot about wanting to make inroads with white working class males, and there were people in the administration who tried to steer her in another way. And only with the Dobbs decision and with her becoming the leading spokesperson of the administration on the abortion issue has she started to embrace what was kind of obvious to everybody from the outside from the onset.
James Carville?
So, Frank, this is a notoriously and pretty effectively tight-lipped operation. I mean, you don't see these guys. I know all of them for a long time. And I consider myself to be friendly with Ricchetti and Mike and Anita and all of them. How did you get this access? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's amazing because this is, some administrations are way more open than others. This is not a particularly, I mean it kind of respectfully, don't get me wrong. And you got all of this access. How did you do it? Tell us your sales secret here.
So much of it is just sticking around. And I also, I think part of it was I'm an opinion journalist. I'm a former editor of the New Republic. I kind of make no bones about my my ideological predilections and the things that I'd like to see happen in the world from a policy perspective. And when Joe Biden was running for president, I wrote a series of articles where I took Joe Biden seriously about what he was proposing. And I was willing to go in and just read the policies and describe the platform. And I think that there was some appreciation for the fact that I was seeing them in those articles as they existed and capturing the fact that Joe Biden didn't want to be a placeholder president, that he was going to propose some really major pieces of legislation. And then I started working on the book, which was originally going to be about the first 100 days. And and it's talking points that you get from people, right? That it's right, like you sit, right. And so you just have to. I mean, the hardest journalistic virtue is patience, and you just have to keep showing up, and you have to keep showing curiosity and asking good faith questions, and not getting distracted by the crap that comes across the transom every day, and have your eye on history. And if Joe Biden hadn't been able to, if Joe Manchin hadn't ultimately passed the Inflation Reduction Act, if the COVID vaccine had been a disaster, I'm not sure I would have been able to pull off a book like that. You need to have instances where you have people who feel triumphalist about something and they want to crow for the sake of history. And so you just have to. There were moments where I was just worried I was wasting my time. I wasn't going to be able to pull off something interesting here. And I was freaking out, quite frankly. And I just had to kind of just remind myself, like, if you stay long enough, if you just keep knocking on the door, then the story will come to you.
So you asked, how do we look at it? How are people looking at this? And I think it's useful to think of this as a race against the clock. All right, what the Biden people would say, yeah, our numbers are not very good. I admit it. But Reagan's numbers weren't very good in August of 83, or Clinton in August of 1995, or Obama in August of 2011. And this economic recovery is going to take hold, and people are going to come to realize that they have it better than they previously thought. That's not an unreasonable argument, all right? Mm-hmm. I can't dismiss that as, you're full of shit. There's some truth to it.
Yeah.
The other argument is people have kind of made up their minds, and they're not likely to change. And we have a real problem with black voters who are having historically low turnout, and I don't have any policy doubt that Joe Biden is the best president we've ever had for black America. I mean, if you just look across the board, employment, income, appointments, you name it. And young people are not enthusiastic, and we're going to go in to 2024 with an enthusiastic white over 65 electorate and a lethargic under 30 and black electorate, and that could produce really bad results. So I'm just giving you the on one hand, the other hand.
Yeah, I think inflation as a political condition is obviously one of the most terminal things that a presidency can be struck by, because the type of pain that people experience with inflation is lasting. It's every day. And it's not likely to dissipate even as conditions improve, because it has this stinging impact. That was the calculus that Joe Biden made with the American Rescue Plan. And I don't know if I don't totally buy the Larry Summers argument that was this massive inflationary thing, but there clearly was a trade-off that they made in their own heads between taking an inflationary risk and then the lessons that Joe Biden learned from the financial crisis, which was that long-term unemployment is this scarring thing. It's what contributed to the rise of Donald Trump. And so he erred on the side of overcorrecting on the full employment front with this risk that there would be some sort of long-tail inflation that followed.
You know, Frank, you describe in rich detail the Afghanistan withdrawal, which I think was the right policy and just terribly executed. I also think that was the start of the Biden slide, as voters thought after Trump they would get competency. And that looked like anything but competent. And I think in many ways that began the age question. And I think if Biden should lose, then I think we're going to look back to August of 2021 and say that was a seminal moment.
I agree. I think that it's hard to go back to that moment and it's hard to go back to the moment and conjure just how close Build Back Better was to passing in its most expansive form, that there could have been this historic expansion of the safety net. And it didn't happen. And Afghanistan is the moment where he got rebuffed. And that's one of the conventional ways in which we judge a Democratic presidency is what have you done to expand the safety net? And while the Biden agenda, I think, is really capacious, it's very significant, there's nothing, he hasn't left that lasting extension of the state in the form of social welfare that Obama did or that Johnson did or Roosevelt did. But you're right that Afghanistan was the beginning of all of these impressions that he's been unable to shake ever since.
So Frank, I'm probably one of 5 people that remember this, but you've done a lot of reporting on Trump's ties to Russia, particularly something called Alpha Bank.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that was a much bigger story than it got picked up. But just talk to us a little bit about that and how enmeshed the whole outfit is with Russia, because it's going to have to come up in 2024.
Yeah, well, that was a story that I published late in the game in the 2020 election. And, it was portrayed by a lot of people on the right as if I was kind of getting fed a story that was intended to be an October surprise. But there was this troubling set of data that nobody has really ever been able to explain. And I talked to a slew of really the top engineers and experts and computer scientists who specialized in this form of data transmission. And they all said there was something interesting and important to pursue here. And you go back and you look over time, at some of the proceedings related to this, and it's clear the FBI never looked that carefully into what happened there. And it's also clear that if you go back and you read something like the Senate Select Committee intelligence report on the 2020 elections, that they were troubled by a lot of this stuff as well. Now, I always allowed for the fact that there was potentially nothing there, but it felt like it was an important thing to be raised because it suggested there were these other patterns that we were seeing in Trump's relationship to Russia. I think that ultimately that's probably a dead end because nobody's been able to prove anything. Nobody's been able to assert anything other than there was some anomalous data. I look more at the Manafort stuff, which was something that Robert Mueller obviously it felt like was, or Robert Mueller's prosecutors, especially Andrew Weissman, thought was the richest trail. And the Mueller investigation got closed down before that was ever followed to its bitter end. And that's always been the thing that I've been left with the most questions about.
Thank you, Alvin.
Let me go. Well, I also don't forget Roger Stone and knowing ahead of time that they were going to leak the emails, the Podesta emails. But
yeah,
I think there was a lot of collusion, whether it was legal or not. A couple of things back to the book. It's fascinating. You describe Biden both as really supremely confident in his own instincts and abilities, and at the same time insecure around some of those better educated elites, if you will. Yet you look at the staff surrounding him, Harvard, Duke, Yale, Georgetown, Columbia. It's rather ironic. And I guess the other question I'd have is that it's a very good staff, very talented staff, but he doesn't really have any peers around him, does he?
One of the for Biden's an Irish Catholic politician who grew up in the 1960s, who really worshipped the Kennedys, especially Robert Kennedy. And I think for Biden, family and clan is kind of the atomic unit of politics. And you look at the people who've been around him; they've been around him since they basically graduated from college, a lot of them. The people like Donald, certainly Ron Klain, that was true. And you would think that there would be all of these rivalries within the staff vying for daddy's attention, but they've kind of managed to work through a lot of that. I mean, you say, why are there no peers in the Biden administration? Well, we did just note his age. There are not many people who go into their 80s wanting to be chiefs of staff to White House chiefs of staff. It's interesting. His closest advisor, probably his closest friend, is this guy Ted Kaufman, who I'm sure you both from
former senator. He would be a peer. He would be a peer.
Yeah. And he talks to Joe Biden on a very regular basis, and they have a kind of a great brotherly relationship where he is in a position where he can tell Joe Biden he's being wrong-headed or stupid or something about something, and Biden will listen. Kaufman, one of the tragedies of a book is all the stuff that lies on the cutting room floor, and I had a lot of opening chapters about the Ted Kaufman, Joe Biden relationship, because if you forgive a little bit of a tangent, Ted Kaufman was the guy that Biden dispatched to Chicago in 2008 during the transition then. And Kaufman is an engineer by training. He worked at DuPont before he went to work for Joe Biden. And he looked at the whole process of presidential transitions and he said, this is incredibly inefficient. This is a very dumb way to build a presidency because it all has to be built on the fly much too late. So he gets appointed senator and he goes into the Senate and he says, I'm only going to be here for a short time. He gets really mad at finance in the course of that, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, does a lot of work calling out the big banks. But then the other thing he does is he starts to craft legislation to fix the presidential transition process. And one bill gets passed, and then when they pass this follow-up bill, reorganizing presidential transitions to extend them, it's named after Ted Kaufman. And so Biden and Kaufman in March of 2020 start talking about how they're going to build a presidency in a different sort of way. And they decided that they were going to start the presidential transition far earlier than anybody's ever done it. I think they hired Ron Klain as chief of staff much earlier than any other president has hired a chief of staff, even though that wasn't publicly known at the time. And Kaufman's theory of the case was that every presidential transition starts with the cabinet, and that he was going to start from the bottom up with all the officials who didn't need Senate confirmation. And so, they had these long lists. They hired Jeff Zients to be their HR department for the new government. And when they arrived in office on day one, they had more people in their seats ready to implement plans that had been hashed out in advance. And so that's part of the reason why you get this initial surge of competence in the administration. And it was phase one of the Biden presidency, which I think in some ways was the best phase.
You know, Franklin, I could see an Atlantic piece called "The First Peer" on Ted Kaufman, but you can figure out what was left out. Let me ask one more question, then James, I know we'll have some. And I come back to where we started. If Joe Biden next week were to step aside, which you said you don't expect, but it wouldn't shock you, yep, he would go down as the most successful one-term president in American history with historic achievements. The right-wing insanity about impeachment would end. Congressional attacks on Hunter Biden would surely subside. I think 2024 Democratic prospects would soar, and he would leave with great honor. Do you think that ever occurs to him or the First Lady?
No, I don't.
Yeah,
I don't think it does. I mean, I think you're invoking the Cincinnatus myth, where he got called back into service. He has this successful period, then he goes back to his farm, and that'd be one of the great stories in political history in its way. But you're asking him to basically be another person, I think, to make a decision like that. I still think that part of the reason why I said I think there's some chance that maybe he arrives at a decision like that is if there was a genuine political crisis where he started to slip and slide and the poll numbers were no longer even, but he had some sort of deficit. I think that might change things. And then also just who knows, he's an 80-year-old guy who knows what happens in the course of time. But those are the two little things that I just kind of can't shake from my mind.
James Carville?
So Al said the secret word, the First Lady, Mrs. Biden. I think the power that she has compared to the coverage that she has is a great mismatch. I can't believe that she doesn't wield a lot of influence.
Absolutely.
With the president at White House.
Absolutely. I was asked, is she Nancy Reagan? And she's not. I mean, she is powerful in maybe certain ways that evoke Nancy Reagan, but Nancy Reagan was a polarizing figure. Nobody hates Jill Biden, which is part of the reason why she can go on the road and stump for Biden and also compensate in certain ways for the type of political campaigning and glad-handing that he's maybe not up for doing. But she does wield that kind of influence. One of the charming things that you read about is her, or hear about from her staff, is that she will tape these encouraging messages to Joe Biden on the bathroom window to get him psyched up in the morning or help him feel better when he's feeling down. When it comes to education, she's so very deep in the weeds. She played a pretty significant part in picking the education secretary. But in terms of changing the political narrative in the way that I think your questions suggest, I think that she is probably the person most capable of doing that.
Generally, in my life in politics, that the spouse is a very important player.
Yeah.
To say the least. Well, Frank, I was so excited when you came on the show. I literally, over the years, I think I've read every word you ever wrote.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm serious. And it was just a big honor for Al and I for you to come on. You got this terrific book out. I think it's, the first is always groundbreaking. And, my hat's off to you for getting the kind of access you did and the kind of reporting you did. I think it's an important first draft of history. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, it's totally my honor to be here with you too. So,
well, I want to second that, Frank. The Last Politician. It's a must-read. It is. You are the Lou Cannon of the Biden administration, and that is high praise indeed.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, and good luck with the book. And let's stay in touch.
Okay. Absolutely. Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
The truth of the matter is, it's going to be 6 trillion individual acts that are going to do as much as, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have policy about government policy, obviously, but, in the terms of products we use and things we do, there are any number of products that you can use that are environmentally sound that fit perfectly with modern life. And that's just a fact. And that's going to be a big contributor how we finally address this issue.
Good point, because making a difference is why you ought to use real paper. It's an incredible way to preserve our forest, and few things are more worth saving after all. Trees don't grow on trees, and sadly, companies are clear-cutting forests just to produce toilet paper. Trees and wood are an amazing resource, but it just doesn't make sense to use them to make a product that we use once and flush away. Trees deserve better, and real paper is a great way we all can take action. Real paper uses bamboo to make sustainable toilet paper, not trees. It grows incredibly fast, and it's a grass, so it can be cut and harvested again and again, just like a lawn. Plus, when you use real, it doesn't feel like you're sacrificing to help the earth. It feels like an upgrade. It's always shipped free to your door in plastic-free packaging, and you schedule it on a subscription so that it comes right when it's needed. You never have to worry about forgetting it and going shopping again. It's comfortable, soft, and after discovering it, James and I won't stock anything else. We love how Real is partnered with One Tree Planted, so with every box of Real that you buy, they are funding reforestation across the country. Real is planting trees, not cutting them down. And Real paper is available in easy, hassle-free subscriptions or for one-time purchases on their website. All orders are conveniently delivered to your door with free shipping and 100% recyclable plastic-free packaging. If you head to realpaper.com/warroom and sign up for a subscription using our code WARROOM at checkout, you'll automatically get 30% off your first order and free shipping. That's realpaper.com/warroom or enter promo code WARROOM to get 30% off your first order plus free shipping. Let's make a change for good this year and switch to Real Paper. Real is a paper for the planet. You also can find the link to the deal in our show notes. Hey, James, one of our very best guests dating back to the fall of 2020 has been Kathleen Belew, history professor at Northwestern University and the foremost authority on the white power movement. Kathleen, as always, it's terrific to have you with us. Kathleen, I'm nervous. I'm more nervous than usual about the potential for violence, the Jacksonville shooting, and you've noted before, these are not, the lone wolves is not an apt description. Trump inciting more anger and maybe potential violence. You follow the traffic. Are my fears legitimate?
I think so. And I think that this last round of convictions of Proud Boys and Oath Keepers on seditious conspiracy charges, particularly the sentencing yesterday, as we're speaking of Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the Proud Boys, many people are talking about this as if these sort of high-level selective actions will cut the head off the snake. And I think what we're dealing with here is really more of a hydra. It is a web of interconnected groups. Some of them operate in open, some of them operate on the underground. And then, of course, we have these mass violent events that appear to be quote unquote lone wolf actions, but are actually, in many cases, and insofar as we're talking about white power activity, are part of this cohesive movement. And we can trace ideological and social connections that really make me and other experts in the space worried about a rising tide of violence.
And we're not thinking of something big like January 6th, that's sui generis, but just a series of smaller but deadly, and anywhere in the country, because you said before, there's no geographical limit to this white power movement.
That's absolutely right. I think the tricky thing here is that we're needing now to track action kind of along a number of different channels. One of the channels is kind of big and performative, and that's where I would categorize January 6th, which was it was imagined by Proud Boys and Oath Keepers as sort of a big flashy recruitment action, right? It's a strike at the heart of power, but it wasn't meant to be a mass casualty event like those carried out by the underground. So then we have the underground, and this is where we see events like the Oklahoma City bombing back in 1995, which killed 168 people. That's where we are likely to see unfolding action. I would like to know more, for instance, about that series of attacks on power stations. I think it's, I'm not privy to the information that the FBI and ATF have about that, but I would be very surprised if there wasn't some amount of ideological content there, just based on the kinds of targets this movement has selected in the past. And then we have the smaller casualty numbers, but those carried out by single gunmen. And here we have Buffalo and Jacksonville, Charleston, El Paso, Christchurch, the Tree of Life Synagogue. We could go on and on. All of those actions are part of the same thing. So, I think it's very hopeful in some ways that we're able to get some seditious conspiracy convictions. That's new. On the other hand, it's really a drop in the bucket when we're talking about the overall sort of set of activities that we've seen in the recent past.
When we spoke to you right after the January 6th Trump-inspired mob attack on the Capitol, and you ventured that Trump has become a figurehead for these radicals, but he might also, if he's indicted and tried, he might also incite more violence. He's now been indicted 4 times. There's probably going to be a trial sometime next spring, at least one. Does it worry you that is going to become a further impetus for violence?
Oh, certainly. I think Trump is leaning very hard into activity by this movement, which at the very least, setting aside, not that we can set such things aside, but even in addition to the body counts and the impacts on affected communities, this has become a news cycle that I think benefits Trump. When we see those convictions of Proud Boy leaders, his base is talking about, politicization of the judicial system and calling for reprisals against the justices, against the FBI, against election workers. So it really fits into the discourse and the way he's talking about this. So we see the Trump campaign more and more overtly embracing these actors. So after January 6th, there was not a step away or any kind of recalibration. What we see instead is Trump meeting with Nick Fuentes at Mar-a-Lago. That's an open white power demonstrator. We see him holding a press conference in Waco, which to people in this movement is not just sort of like a vague anti-government gesture. It's a call to additional violence along the lines of the Oklahoma City bombing. So everything has become bigger and more overt, even as I think the rest of us are becoming somewhat desensitized, because this is just a string. It's action after action after action. It's hard to keep up with all of it.
James.
So, Professor, is there any policy thing that we institute, either legislatively or administratively? Is there some kind of policy response to this problem as you set out?
Yes, absolutely. And that's such a great question, because I think one thing we don't want to do is get overly focused on our judicial system as the only mechanism of dealing with this problem, because it's working better than it did in the late 80s. We're getting some seditious conspiracy convictions when they're warranted. That wasn't always possible before. But seditious conspiracy convictions are only going to be sort of selectively useful. I think the biggest lever for change would be getting serious about following through on a lot of what was decided and recommended immediately after January 6th. So, for instance, during the Department of Defense stand down after the 6th, they made a number of promises about getting serious about extremism within the armed forces, which has been a tremendous problem for our nation, at least since the 1980s, when people were recruiting active duty troops, stealing munitions and explosives from U.S. posts and bases, and running paramilitary camps using military infrastructure. That's a huge problem. I think reasonable people can agree that you can't protect the nation from enemies, foreign and domestic, and also be an enemy domestic at the same time. But the military has not been able to enforce these very reasonable recommendations. So a recent report by USA Today just found that the DoD hasn't even been doing all of the exit interviews about how big a problem extremism is in the armed forces, much less some of the more aggressive actions it pledged, like keeping active duty troops from retweeting extremist content, from being part of groups that actively agitate for the overthrow of the country. These are basic actions we should be able to follow through. And one begs it just begs the question, why not?
Well, I think the answer is they're having real recruiting shortages. And if you got rid of all the racists in the U.S. military, you'd be with a pretty thin force. But that's just my own 2 cents worth. Before I turn it over to Al, I mean, you follow this better than probably anybody in the country. How confident are you that the FBI and the ATF and people like this are kind of on top of this, monitoring it, looking for things? Could you talk to that just a second, please?
Sure. So the good news there is that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have really reoriented their mission around this problem. They've declared white power extremism and militant right extremism, or what they call CVE, violent extremism, as the number one terrorist threat to the nation. So that's where our resources are now at those agencies. The bad news is that we are very, very late to the party. It's really only since 2017 that agencies have begun to dedicate resources, and really only in the last 2 or 3 years that we've seen the kinds of resources dedicated that we would really need to get a handle on this problem. In those years, there has been just like an exponential increase in activity among extremist groups. I would need to go see the numbers myself, but I was just a co-panelist with someone from the center that studies these numbers out of University of Nebraska at Omaha. And it's just, the numbers are just stunning. It is a huge increase. The trend line is going up at just an exponential rate. So the good news is that our watchdogs are oriented in a good direction here. The bad news is just we are very late to the game. So the question is how fast people can work to contain the threat.
Well, thank you, Albert.
Let me pick up on the FBI, and I'm fascinated that Christopher Wray, who by most accounts has done a good job and has been, as you say, aggressive on this, very forthright about the dangers these white power extremists pose. He's now become a villain among right-wing Republicans. Many of the presidential candidates are saying, I'm going to fire Christopher Wray. On the Hill, all the right-wingers. I mean, this connection between the white power movement, the extremists, and at least it would appear some elected politicians as at least as enablers or non-critics.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we don't have to stretch very far to see how intently the blowback is for anyone to begin this kind of questioning on the national level. And, we have to trace some direct lines from discourse about I'm going to fire Christopher Wray to, the ground level extremist blowback against the FBI, against the IRS, against, there was just one this week, I think, about election workers in Maricopa County, Arizona. Yep. Those are just folks who are doing their duty as civil servants. I think that we really are sort of at a precarious moment about the future of our ability to have free elections if we can't trust these sort of basic fundamental institutional responses to violence and organized violence, especially. And I mean, it's not, there used to be perceptible daylight between the GOP and the more extremist white power content. There is now no daylight between those positions. And that's not to say that everyone in the GOP is sort of taken over with all of this, but certainly there are people who have infiltrated into the GOP and are now steering both in local and national ways, how our conversation works, how our discourse works, and sort of where the response is going to land.
Yeah, boy, you really do see it. Many of them are vowing to get rid of Christopher Wray. Talk just for a minute about the role that social media plays in the white power movement.
Sure. I think social media is best thought of as just an exponential increaser of everything. So what it really is doing is creating this superhighway of information by which a number of older strategies used by these groups are now just supercharged and very, very fast. The one that really scares me is that there was a study, and I'm going to blank on the specifics, but it was something like from the homepage of YouTube, to take one example, it's only 4 or 5 clicks to white power content. These algorithms deliver people very quickly into this content so that something that begins quite benign can take you into radicalizing ideological content incredibly fast. So, to all the parents out there, this is an alarming piece of information because it doesn't take a long time for a young adult unsupervised online to encounter this content. It's a conversation all parents should be having with their kids about what to do when they see this kind of material. Another example is something like TikTok, which has fun videos. Very quickly, you can get from sort of like, how do I can my own food, to content about what's called trad wives or traditional housewives, sort of white power, feminine homemaking spaces that looks very innocuous at first and turns out to be radicalizing content. So all of these are very slippery pieces of the puzzle. And I think to me, the antidote really is the awareness of that broader context, because that's how you know what you're consuming.
Right. Let me just ask one question before turning it back to James. I am struck by these grievances have historical precedence. As you've noted, the Jacksonville shooter was wearing the Rhodesian flag emblem. Rhodesia was the white segregationist country that 40 years ago was replaced by Zimbabwe. There's been South Vietnamese flags that have been waved. At the same time, America is now strengthening our relationships with a different Vietnam. I mean, this stuff really goes back. I mean, at least their memories go back and their grievances go back a while.
Yes. And to me, as a historian, when I see those sorts of symbols, the Rhodesian flag wielded by the Jacksonville shooter, also by the Charleston shooter, Dylan Roof had the Rhodesian flag patch prominently displayed in his social media. The South Vietnamese flag is now sort of a coded reference to being anti-communism and therefore, anti-woke, I suppose, is the present day corollary, or the Proud Boys wearing the Pinochet was right shirts, referring to, it's a hagiography of the Southern Code dictatorships of the 70s. These are all sort of really clear signs if you're a historian, right? Because what they're doing is calling back to this earlier set of ideological framings in a way that tells us a lot about the through lines, about the durability of the white power movement in our history. And it really affirms for me that earlier sort of mode of operation is still what we're dealing with to me, that's good news because we can read the playbook. We have the long history of that earlier movement. We have the broad view. We're able to see the underground and how it worked in that earlier period, even when we can't see it in real time. So to me, that's really the call to read the history and understand how it all works. Sort of like learning a second language. We can see how it works by looking at that earlier moment.
Yeah, we sure can. James.
One question before we let you go, Professor. First of all, thank you so much for your tremendous insight on this. This is viewed by a lot of people as a uniquely male problem. I don't think that's your view, is it? I mean, and being a good feminist that you are, stand up and say women can be just as crazy as men can be.
Oh, absolutely. I think, one of the big surprises for me in writing about this movement in the 1980s and 90s was how much women's relationships and real women were important to holding the movement together. Now, we often don't see the women when we're talking about an organized paramilitary groundswell because if you think about something like Unite the Right, women were told to stay in the motel rooms while men marched through the streets. So if you just look at the pictures, it sure looks like a male movement from out here, right? But the women were there in those hotel rooms and they've been posting online and they're running the Trad Wives bulletin boards. And they're, in the earlier period, the marriage relationships are one of the major ways we can know how interwoven these social groups were, even as they're trying to come off as neutral. In the sentencing yesterday, we saw something that has been a feature of these legal moments, which is women standing up to testify for their men as sort of a mechanism of calling for public sympathy. Now, that's not to say that the women in this particular case are or are not in the movement. I'm not in a position to talk about that. But in prior seditious conspiracy trials, the presence of women, even fainting women and women who are performing martyrdom in really conspicuous ways have been used to secure lower sentences or acquittals. So the presence of women here does a lot of important work. And, they'll tell you themselves, they speak in their own sort of mechanisms throughout this movement as well.
Yeah. Just one observation before I let you go. I watched a lot of Nazi propaganda, Triumph of the Will, and what's really striking is how many women were on when Hitler was going through the street. You'd see more women than men. And I started noticing that because of the earlier conversation I had with you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I always show Triumph of the Will as opening to all of my classes because it's propaganda.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, there's also just a kind of basic thing that we should all remember, which is, when we're talking about glossy terms like the Great Replacement theory, which is what a lot of people have been concerned about lately, it's really a new word for the same thing that's been motivating all of this the whole time, which is the idea that the white race will somehow be overrun or driven to extinction by modern society, whether it's through immigration or abortion or feminism or interracial relationships or what have you. All of that at the end of the day comes down to the regulation of white women and their sexual practices, right? Because they have to secure white babies to continue a white race. That has sort of accidentally given women an enormous measure of symbolic power within these groups. And even though they are, very anti-feminist, and the women themselves will tell you they're anti-feminist, women do wield an enormous amount of rhetorical and symbolic force because of that position. So you do see the women over and over again, sometimes being deployed as symbols by men, but often like claiming that in their own way in order to galvanize this movement.
Well, I got to tell you, you are one of our great guests. We learn every time. I can't say I go away feeling better afterwards, Kathleen, but I sure know a lot more. And all I can say is the country's lucky to have people like you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Way to stand up for your gender. Y'all can be as stupid as we can.
All right. Go teach those Northwestern students. Thank you, Kathleen.
Oh, thank you very much.
now for the outrage of the week. James, for the second week in a row, I am combining my outrage and the Screw the Voters segment. Remember last week, it was some Georgia yahoos who wanted to oust Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis for the audacity of indicting Donald Trump. I think Georgia Governor Brian Kemp put an end to that. But also remember, it was only in April that Wisconsin voters overwhelmingly elected Janet Protasiewicz by double digits to the state Supreme Court. That gave Democrats progressive a 4-3 majority, ending 15 years of conservative Republican domination, during which conservatives enacted voting restrictions and partisan gerrymandered districts. Now, those can be reversed by the new court, and that strikes fear with these entrenched Republicans who don't want anyone to touch their political protection racket. So what are the Republican legislators planning? I'm serious now. This woman was elected overwhelmingly 4.5 months ago. They're going to try to impeach her. They're going to try to impeach her, to say, screw you to the voters who just elected her and to the rule of law. And again, to quote myself from last week, this is the way fascist governments, think hungry, operate. Wisconsin has several historical political strains. One is the open, inclusive La Follette legacy. The other is the darkness of Joe McCarthy. Republican Assembly Speaker Robin Vos is taking the dark route.
Well, I had a conflict on my outrage, and both of them in today's New York Times. The one I did not use, but the significant, is apparently Medicare costs have just flattened and not that big a deal. Never in history have so many been so wrong about something so big. In the 90s, I would point out, in the early 2000s, to be against entitlement reform was to be for segregation. As it turned out, not so much. But I got to go to my outrage with the Ross Duhart column. This guy passes himself off as a deeply thoughtful conservative. You know, you can like it or not, but he thinks about deep things. So I see the headline, even James Bond is going woke. I'm like, oh shit, I can't, what are they doing now? Evidence of his wokeness, his new girlfriend is an immigration lawyer. Oh, my God, that anybody should date an immigration lawyer, a hero, is, well, my God, that's so woke. Secondly, it's a fake plot to assassinate King Charles, and a lot of it brews in the Brexit community. As if thinking that Brexit is the stupidest idea that a country could come up with, make someone woke a part of the fringe left, is asinine. Further evidence of wokeness is apparently in the fiction, it has something to do with Hungary and the autocratic, anti-democratic government they have there. Is that what the fuck you're talking about in terms of wokeness? You can't date an immigration lawyer without having the New York Times op-ed page come after you? It was so goddamn vapid, it's hard for me to express it. And hey, you think Brexit was a good idea? Find me 5 people that know anything that agree with you. But at any rate, that's my outrage of the week, is a stupid Ross Duhart column.
All right, and now for our listener questions, which are fabulous, as always. Andrew in Los Angeles, James, says the House Republicans appear to be choosing between 2 suicide missions, a government shutdown or a Biden impeachment. Could you expound on how this might play out and what the effects would be politically?
Well, I'll tell you what I think. First of all, politically, that's all I care about. They ought to I hope they shut the government down. They never win this. They always look stupid doing it. Okay? Go ahead. As Clint Eastwood would say, make my day. On the impeachment thing, there's a secret part of me that hopes that they do this or they launch an investigation. And I'll tell you why. James Comer is a very much a lightweight. In fact, he's borderline stupid. All right? Jim J.Y.M. Jordan is... Well, he's a creep. Let's just put it that way. Our people are very good on this committee. I don't have any fear of having an impeachment inquiry. I think at the end of the day, it'd probably be beneficial to Democrats. Now, he said, well, that's not good for the country, and you don't want to shut. I understand that. But in terms of being good for politics, which is kind of my role on this show, I'm all for shut the government down and have an impeachment inquiry. Get your ass handed to you.
Yeah. Well, this is a sequel to that. Chip in Milford, Kansas asked why McCarthy won't make a deal with Democrats that would allow him to push more moderate positions and shut out the extreme right from continuing to paralyze the government. If he enlisted Democratic support, he can maintain his speakership and probably cement his legacy as a great American that worked out of partisan gridlock. Great American and Kevin McCarthy, I'm sorry, Chip, I just can't say that in the same sentence. He can't do that because he's scared. He's scared stiff. He's scared stiff that they'll dump him. And if Republicans dump him and they have the votes to do that, I don't know that Democrats will come to his aid. I don't think they will. They don't want a long-term Kevin McCarthy. He hasn't done anything for them. This is different than John Boehner. So I think Kevin McCarthy is scared every single moment. He just looks to his left, looks to his right, and it's just all bad. And it's awful hard to be an effective legislative leader or a leader of anything when you're running scared.
I totally concur with your observation. And the guy he just don't have it. And I think we're probably better off with him running around like a scared rabbit than anything else. And the Democrats are not going to rescue him. That's ludicrous.
Right. He's done nothing to it. Nothing.
Right. No, he's got stew in his own ship that he's made. And they probably might, they could do this. You could explain that motion to vacate. They get five Republicans and he's done.
Right. Exactly. And, every moment he thinks about that. James, our next question is about one of our favorite politicians and, maybe a problem. Sandy in Rockville, Maryland says, if Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro is such a great leader, which I think James and I both are enormously impressed with him, why can't he fix the disaster that is the Pennsylvania Democratic Party? They're a mess. I have just read several pieces lately that says that the party is kind of screwed up. I did not know that. I'm not sure if it's true, but there must be some kind of problems up in the Keystone State with the Democrats politically.
I read that story and several people texted me. I don't know, can't tell you that it's wrong. I'm telling you that bitching about the party in campaigns is a chronic disease among Democrats in Pennsylvania. They're always dissatisfied about everything.
Right.
But if the party
no walking around money and
well, goddamn, you spend all that money on television and I don't see anything on the street and you got to, I mean, I've worked in a lot of different states. I've never seen bigger complainers than state committeemen in Pennsylvania. For some reason, I think the governor in South Shore are on top of this problem. I don't quite know what it is. We're having a big Casey reunion, 6th and 7th of October. I'll find out about it. But I have never seen a time when Pennsylvania Democrats were not bitching about everything. And that's I've had a lot of experience with it, let me tell you.
They'd be miserable if they weren't unhappy, James, right?
Right. Oh, God, man.
Drew in Cleveland, Ohio. This is a really interesting question. Says, if McConnell resigns from the Senate, are there any never-Trump candidates who could be appointed to replace him? If the Democrats keep the governorship and have to replace him with a Republican, who would be the best choice for the Democrats? The context is that the Republican legislature passed a law saying that if there's a Senate vacancy, the party of that person who's vacated gets to pick, I get James, 2 or 3 nominees to which the governor has to select. I think some Democrats are saying, hey, no way. That's not the way it works. And there is a good chance if Beshear is reelected, which I would bet he would be, as close as it may be in Kentucky, and McConnell does have to resign, which I don't know that he will. I rather doubt it, actually. I don't necessarily think Beshear has to follow that. It'll be a great legal test.
He's got a constitutional backup. The Constitution refers to the executive replacing senators,
right?
Which, you don't have to be a great lawyer to know the Constitution trumps everything, including Kentucky state law.
Right.
So, and of course, one of the things that the Beshear people were scared of, if McConnell would resign prior to August the 7th, it would mandate there be an election in November. And I think the last thing they wanted was a nationalized election.
Yeah.
All right. So now, if God forbid, I hope McConnell, I don't wish that on anybody, but if something would have happened to him, then the governor would be able to appoint. I suspect the appointment wouldn't last that long, but I do know that August 6th was a significant date, and I do know that the Constitution does make alludes to the executive filling Senate seats. So it gives some confidence going into this.
Yeah, well, all right, that's encouraging. I agree. We don't know anything about Mitch McConnell's health, really. I think it's, I really wish he would. I really wish he would be more forthcoming. I don't think you can, lack transparency in that, but apparently that may not be so good. James,
man's life is dedicated to anti-transparency. But go ahead.
Ellen wants to know, really, this is, wait a minute, I'm going to come back to you next, but I'm looking here. Oh yeah, Ethan in Toronto, Canada wants to know if James has any good stories from the filming of his scene with John McCain in Wedding Crashers.
It was pretty quickly done. We were at I guess it was a cocktail party or something like that, but it was fun to be part of it. It was a great movie, and it I got that in old school in my. Okay, I got that in old school in my in my portfolio. So it was funny. Senator McCain, I know him well, but he had any number of encounters with him, and he's pretty much what you think he is. He's a pretty charming guy. Was a pretty charming guy, and very, very agreeable to get along with.
Oh boy, he sure was. Our family spent a long weekend in Sedona, and he was great company. We have one question here that is from Bruce in Olympia, Washington, who says nothing is more important to the reelectability than an economy. The current debt limit extension could lead to a government shutdown, which will compromise the debt rating. I have to tell you, Bruce, that's a concern. I think the politics of the government shutdown are all in the Democrats, all in the White House favor. I mean, these people are just irrational. First of all, they're not keeping to an agreement that Kevin McCarthy and others made. They're breaking their word. And people don't like government shutdowns. If I have any worry, if it's any kind of an extended government shutdown, it could adversely affect the economy. And then 6 months later, people will worry about the economy. But I actually doubt there's going to be a long shutdown of any sort.
Well, a couple of significant things. First is Goldman Sachs has reduced its recession probability to 15%.
Right.
I mean, 20, the hysteria we were getting on the economy was unbelievable. Secondly, Business Week, which is particularly hysterical on the economy, some people talking about 5.2% growth. Now that would be beyond historic. I mean, I think we had that like right after the pandemic, but that's a rare thing. So I look at these economic prognosticators and I look at these Medicare numbers, and you can't help but think, maybe there's some good things going on out there. I don't know.
Yeah. I think you're right. James, I've been looking through. I can't find any questions from Rhode Island, but if we had one, they would probably ask about your take on election that was held there this week.
It was a Democratic primary, and it's significant in this extent. It's a Rhode Island first. So it's Providence, Newport. It's a 63%, Biden district. So there's not much chance we're going to lose a general. But you had a classic thing of a leftist candidate who happened about this. Give people don't know why, but I'll mention it happened to be white. But Bernie came in and endorsed him. AOC, he was the progressive hope. I read a lot of these progressive sites, and they said that this person was going. Another person in the race was a Hispanic woman who was the lieutenant governor, whose campaign kind of fell apart, but for whatever reason, the guy that won was a black guy, but he was a very establishment Democrat. He worked for Obama. He worked for Biden. Senate the White House was for him. All of his spots showed him. And so the idea was that this new energetic person from the left and, huge majority Democratic district, Brown University, this was going to be a triumph of progressive politics. Well, the guy got 24%. I mean, I don't know how many times these people have to lose a primary before they figure out that people are just not buying this left-wing crap. I really don't. And you know, when you see it in Rhode Island 1, you can't imagine what it is everywhere else. So I thought that, and I got a friend of mine is, you know, really follows that closely, and I got a pretty good briefing about what happened. And all this guy did was run spots in that primary about how he worked for President Obama and he worked for President Biden. And he won by like 8 points or something. I think it's a lesson there. And the left was humping this. They thought they had the momentum going into election day or whatever they thought. They were colossally wrong.
Yeah, well, that has happened more and more. All right, keep those questions coming in. If we didn't get to them this week, we'll try to get to them next week because we really appreciate your insights.
Whatever you do, don't date an immigration lawyer. Jesus Christ.
Hey, thanks for listening to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. Don't forget to send your questions for us by email to politicswarroom@gmail.com or tweet them for next week's show at Politicon. Following this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you'd check out the link to our sponsor, Real Paper, in our episode show notes. We deeply thank you for supporting them because when you do, you help make this podcast happen. Now, to keep up with us, subscribe to Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You also can find the shows you might enjoy in the Politicon YouTube channel or when you search Politicon on your favorite podcast sites. Remember, please rate the show with a 5-star review. We'll be back next week with another show as we continue our War Room planning.